So it's now time to build the core of our application, essentially what we're going to be accessing database data with. Our system wouldn't work properly without this. We wouldn't be able to store anything. And what we're going to be building here is a database wrapper. And essentially what this is, it's an abstracted way to work with our database and give ourselves easy to work with functionality. Now, the beauty of this database wrapper is that it can be used outside of this application as well. So once you finish writing this code, you're going to be able to use this in anything you do. And that's the point really of building it like this. It's code reusability, something that isn't tied directly to our application. We can use this anywhere we want. Now we're going to be using Pdo, PHP data objects, for the sole reason that we can actually then define what kind of database that we want to work with. In this case, we're going to be using MySQL because it's so popular, but we can, of course, change this and work with any other database that's supported by Pdo. So let's go ahead and start to define our class. Now we're going to be testing this along the way in our index.php file. So we're going to be looking at the kind of things it does. And we're also going to be keeping an eye on our database. So we're going to be inserting things, extracting things, querying, updating, looking at security and stuff like that. So this is quite a large thing to build, but once we're done, we can sort of relax and know that we can work really efficiently with our database. So let's go ahead and define the class. This is just going to be DB. Now we're going to be working with a pattern in PHP called the Singleton Pattern. So we're going to have a main static method called getInstance, and this is just going to allow us to get an instance of our database if it's already been instantiated. And basically this means that we don't have to keep connecting to our database again and again and again on each page. We can just use the database on the fly as we want. If you were to create a class with a constructor, which we'll do in a moment, you would be, every time you need to instantiate your database object to perhaps create a new query and take a new set of results, you'd be connecting to your database again and again and again, which is very, very inefficient. So we're just going to be using the getInstance static method in this case. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry. As we build the code, it will make perfect sense, hopefully. So the first thing that we're going to do is create we can create a private static variable called instance. That's going to be null, and let's give that a underscore as well. So what we've done here is we've created a private static property to our object, and this is going to store the instance of the database if it's available. If it's not available, we're going to instantiate our DB object from within it and store it here. Again, sounds complicated, but once we get around this pattern, it's going to make things things should become a lot clearer eventually. So we have some other private properties. These aren't going to be static properties. These are just going to be private properties within our object, which won't be accessible to outside of this class, won't be accessible to anything that extends from this. We just need them to be private. There's no need for them to be public. So we have private Pdo, and the underscore basically is a notation that lets us know that as we're using these, they are private properties and they're not public or protected. Protected would use underscore too. So we have Pdo query, and I'll explain all these in just a moment. Error, results, and count. We're going to set count to 0, and we're going to set error to false. Now we can bring these down line by line to just make it look a bit neater, make things make a little bit more sense. So what's happening here is we've got Pdo. This is going to represent the when we instantiate the Pdo object, we're going to store it here so we can use it elsewhere. Query is going to be the last query that's executed. Error is going to represent whether there's an error or not, so whether the query failed or not, and we'll have a method to check or return whether there has been an error. We have results, which will store our results set, so if we were to pick, say, all users with the first name Alex, that will be our result set. Say there's 10 users, they'll all be stored there. And the count of results, which is extremely important because we're also going to provide a method that's going to allow us to say, you know, is there have there been any results returned or something like that. So basically the way that we're going to use our database class is going to be similar to this. So it's really useful to take a look at what we actually want our database object to do, and then we can build it. So for example, let's say we want to grab a list of all users. The way we want this to work is we want to have basically the ability to just say get me a certain amount of data. So quite simply we could say something like users equals db get instance. Now this is going to be the method, the static method that we're going to create as part of the Singleton object. So we will cover this in detail in a moment, and we'll then say something like query select username from users. So that's it. Now what we can do is say something like if users count. That would actually probably be a method that we'd use. So let's create that as a method. Then we can say for each users as user echo username, and because we're going to be returning an object, this basically represents the field name in a database. So that would represent this. So this is the way that we're going to be building things. Now there's a lot more functionality than this, but you can see, looking at this, it makes it a lot easier to work with your database rather than having to, you know, connect to Pdo at the top of your page, execute a query, blah blah blah. We can basically do everything like this, and we're going to have a lot of helper methods as well that are going to allow us to define things in a certain way. So for example, we could say get from users, and we could say, yeah, so we can define something like where username equals Alex. So we're basically going to be building this functionality, and it makes it so easy to work with your database. I mean, look at that. It sort of reads like a book. Get users where the username equals Alex, or username is greater than 5, or it wouldn't be username, would it? It would be something like points. I don't know. You can use this for a variety of purposes. So that's what we're basically going to be doing. So let's go ahead and create our constructor function, and this is just all this is going to do is connect to our database. So let's go ahead and create a private method, and this will be construct, and this is run when the class is instantiated. Now we're going to try the Pdo connection, and we're going to catch a Pdo error. So this is basically a try catch block, which allows you to basically catch errors inside of the try block. So if we do have an error, we're basically just going to kill the application and then output the message that's returned from this. And when we are working with our connection, we'll mess around with the settings and see how this affects it. But what we're going to do is we're going to set the Pdo private Pdo property to the Pdo connection. So we're going to say new Pdo, and this is just standard syntax. You can find this in the PHP documentation. So the way this basically looks is it's a string, then we have a username and a password. The initial string defines what database basically handler, or whatever, however you want to call it, you want to connect to, and then it defines the database name as well, and the host, obviously. So in this case, we're connecting to a MySQL database. The host is going to be basically the host that we define, and I'm just going to put X's and Y's and Z's here because we're going to use our config class that we created to actually handle this. So the host is going to be 127.0.0.1. The DB name is going to be the database name that we defined, and then we have a username and we have a password. So we'll put Z and A, for example. So for the host, let's go ahead and just concatenate on a value. This is going to be config get MySQL host, as we saw when we created our config here. So this is basically reading MySQL host. So the database name is going to be config get MySQL DB. Simple as that. And then for the username and the password, we already know that we've stored these in the config. They are here and here. So we just do exactly the same thing. Config get MySQL username, and exactly the same here. So let's just go ahead and just copy and paste this and change this to password. So that's it. That's our line of connecting to our database. Let's go ahead and give this a go. Just by saying db equals new db, and we'll look at sorting this out in just a moment. In fact, this is not going to work, and this is the whole point of the Singleton pattern. We need to call db instance. So if we were to say db get instance, we we create the public static method, and that's going to be called getInstance. Now what this is going to do, it's going to check if we've already instantiated our object, and by instantiating our object we're connecting to our database. If we haven't instantiated, we're going to instantiate it. If we have, we're going to return the instance. So in this case we need a check here to say if the instance is not set, so that's self. Remember, we're dealing with static properties here, so we need to use self and then the scope resolution operator here, and we're going to say self instance. So if that's not been set, we want to actually go ahead and set that. New DB, sorry. So what this is going to do is, if this isn't set, which by default it won't be when we're using this on, say, one page, we want to go ahead and create a new DB instance. That's going to run this, set PDO here, and it's then going to return self instance. So we can start using all of the functionality of our class or our object. So if in the case that we use this twice on a page, this will no longer be valid. So this will return false, and all we'll do is just return the instance that we're currently working with. We can create a new query. We just don't have to reconnect to our database. So let's take a look at and sort of prove how this actually works. So let's refresh. So we don't have an error. We know now that we are more than likely just using the right credentials. But if we were to say root Z or something like that, we go ahead and refresh, you can see that we kill the page and we get the error back there. So we know that we're connecting successfully to our database, or we can safely assume that we are. Let's take a look at what happens here. So if I go ahead and echo connected here, in fact we'll put that inside of the try block. So let's go ahead and refresh. So we say connected. Now because we would ordinarily be running the constructor function every time we instantiate this class, create an object from it, we'd assume that if we were to do this, then we would see this message again and again and again. But because we're first calling getInstance, we're checking whether this has been set or not, i.e. we're checking whether this private construct method has been called and we've actually connected to our database. So when I refresh now, refreshing the page, we only connect once. Now if this was to be reversed and we had this as a public function, and we were to ignore the fact that we were to get instance, and we were to say something like db equals new db, and do this over and over and over and over again, what we're then doing is, if we were to use this down a page a few times, we're connecting to our database again and again and again. There's no need to. We only need to store one connection, one sort of link to our database, if you like. So by doing this, we actually avoid the need to have to, or even accidentally connect to our database again and again and again. So we've connected to our database. Really what's left to do now is just go over the useful methods that we need to create inside of our database. to be able to pull data and actually manipulate data, update things, delete records, and things like that.